The most watched finale in American television history wasn't a superhero movie, a political thriller, or a celebrity wedding. It was a war comedy about army surgeons in Korea. And on February 28, 1983, 106 million people sat down to watch it end. MASH ran for 11 seasons on CBS, outlasting the actual Korean War by nearly a decade. And somewhere between the laughter and the grief, it became something television had never quite managed before. A show that made people feel the weight of armed conflict without ever letting them look away. What most viewers never saw was how many times the show nearly tore itself apart from the inside. Cast departures, creative battles, personal breakdowns, contractual chaos. The story behind the camera was almost as dramatic as anything that aired on it, and the reasons the actors left will genuinely surprise you. Before any of that, though, the origin matters. Dr. Richard Hooker, the pen name of Korean War surgeon H. Richard Hornberger, published MASH, a novel about 3 army doctors in 1968, blending gallows humor with the bitter reality of mobile army surgical hospital life. Hollywood noticed quickly. Director Robert Altman adapted it into a film in 1970, casting Donald Sutherland as Hawkeye Pierce and Elliot Gould as Trapper John, and the satirical black comedy struck a nerve with audiences already exhausted by the Vietnam War. That film won the Palme d'Or at Cannes and an Academy Award for Best Adapted Screenplay, which is the kind of attention that gets a network moving fast. CBS developed the television version with Larry Gelbart and Gene Reynolds, debuting it on September 17, 1972. Alan Alda stepped into the role of Hawkeye, and though the first season nearly got canceled outright, a move to Saturday nights turned the ratings around completely. From that point forward, the show rewrote what a sitcom could be, using real war footage, swapping the laugh track for the sound of helicopters, and letting Alda take on writing and directing responsibilities that pushed the series deeper into moral complexity with every passing season. McLean Stevenson arrived as Colonel Henry Blake, the warm-hearted, perpetually bewildered commanding officer of the 477th, and for 3 seasons, he was exactly what the show needed. A Golden Globe followed, along with genuine affection from audiences. But as Alda grew into not just the lead actor, but the creative architect of the series, Stevenson's role began to shrink, and the frustration that built inside him eventually became impossible to contain. He told People magazine in 1975 that he wanted to be the one carrying the show, not supporting someone else's vision of it. That wasn't arrogance so much as ambition, the kind that makes sense when you believe you have more to offer than anyone is asking for. At the end of season 3, he walked into the producer's office and told them he was done. What happened next changed television. Rather than sending Henry Blake off with a transfer and a handshake, Gelbart and Reynolds decided to honor the reality of what the show was actually about. In the final minutes of the season 3 finale, Radar walked into the operating room mid-surgery, hat in hand, and delivered news nobody in the audience was prepared to hear. Henry Blake's plane had been shot down over the Sea of Japan, and there were no survivors. No music swelled, no laugh track cushioned the moment. Just silence, and the sound of surgical equipment in a room full of stunned faces. Most of the cast learned the ending in real time, the same moment the cameras rolled, which meant those reactions, raw and completely unscripted, belonged to the actors, not the characters. CBS received thousands of letters afterward, some praising the honesty, others furious that a beloved character had been taken without warning. Gelbart stood behind the decision and put it plainly: not everybody gets to go home. Stevenson signed with NBC, launched the McLean Stevenson show, and appeared to be charting his own course. 1 season later, it was canceled. A second attempt, Hello Larry, fared worse and spent years being referenced by critics as a cautionary tale about overestimating your leverage. By 1983, Stevenson admitted to the Los Angeles Times that he had taken himself out of the game. Alda remembered him after his death in 1996 as a wonderful actor and a good man. The role Stevenson had walked away from turned out to be the most enduring work of his career. Wayne Rogers had a quieter exit, but a messier one underneath the surface. As Trapper John McIntyre, Rogers shared top billing with Alda in the early seasons, and the chemistry between them carried the show through its shakiest years. Rogers had signed on expecting a genuine ensemble format, equal weight distributed across the core cast, and what developed instead was something closer to a one-man show, with supporting players arranged carefully around it. Alda's increasing involvement in writing and directing accelerated that shift, and Trapper John went from co-lead to the character who nodded along at everything Hawkeye said. Rogers described it exactly that way in later interviews, not out of bitterness, but with the straightforward clarity of someone who had done the math and found it didn't add up. The part that complicated everything was this. Rogers had never formally signed his contract. The agreement existed on a handshake, which meant when the producers threatened legal action after he declined to return for season 4, they had no ground to stand on. Rogers had broken nothing, because nothing was legally binding. The departure was so abrupt that the writers scrambled to open season 4 with a throwaway explanation. Trapper had been discharged while Hawkeye was away on leave. No farewell episode, no hospital send-off, no goodbye. Mike Farrell stepped in as BJ Honeycutt, written with more emotional depth and less rebellious energy, and the show shifted tone almost immediately. Rogers went on to build a second career as a financial analyst and television commentator, eventually becoming a regular panelist on Fox News discussing economics and policy, and by most accounts, he never looked back with much regret. Alda called him one of the smartest people he had ever worked with, and that friendship held long after the departure. Rogers died in 2015 at 82. Gary Burghoff was the only member of the television cast who had also appeared in the 1970 Robert Altman film, and that continuity gave Radar O'Reilly a depth the character might not have found otherwise. Where the film's Radar had been slippery and a little cunning, Burghoff rebuilt him entirely as someone genuinely innocent, a young man whose instincts bordered on supernatural, and whose tenderness made the violence surrounding him feel sharper by contrast. For 7 seasons that performance held. Then the weight of it started breaking him open. The production schedule was brutal. The perfectionism Burghoff brought to every scene compounded the exhaustion, and the time away from his young daughter accumulated into a grief he described decades later as a mistake he never stopped regretting. Mike Farrell recalled in a 2018 interview that Burghoff always felt he wasn't receiving the recognition he deserved, though Farrell believed he had underestimated how deeply the cast respected him. Contractual disputes followed, over salary, scheduling flexibility, screen time. And though the producers tried to accommodate him with fewer appearances per season, none of it addressed the real problem, which was that Burghoff was emotionally finished. Season 8 gave him a proper farewell in a 2-part episode called Goodbye Radar, in which the company clerk finally accepts that his mother needs him at home and that the 4077th will survive without him. The final image was almost wordless. Radar walking away, silhouetted against the Korean sky, his teddy bear left behind on Hawkeye's bunk. After MASH, Burghoff stepped away from Hollywood and redirected his energy toward painting, wildlife conservation, and inventing, including a patented fishing tackle system. His exit from public life was, by all accounts, entirely deliberate. Larry Linville played Major Frank Burns for 5 seasons, with a commitment to pettiness that was almost admirable in its consistency, and the character served a real function in the show's early years. Someone the audience could dislike freely, while everything else demanded more complicated feelings. Linville recognized before the producers did that Frank had stopped evolving, that the comedy the character generated was calcifying into repetition. At the end of season 5, he chose not to renew, explaining he had taken Frank as far as the character could go. No dramatic exit, no hard feelings, just a clean professional decision that opened space for something the show hadn't tried yet. David Ogden Stiers arrived in season 6 as Charles Emerson Winchester III, arrogant and cultured and far more difficult to dismiss than Frank had ever been. Where Frank was a punchline, Winchester was a puzzle, a man whose pride kept getting punctured by what medicine in a war zone actually demanded. Stiers stayed through the series finale, and his final scene, teaching Chinese prisoners of war to play Mozart, carried a weight that Frank Burns never could have generated. Stiers came out publicly as gay in 2009, explaining he had kept it private for decades out of concern that it would cost him roles, particularly the voice work he was doing for Disney. He passed away in 2018 at 75. Loretta Swit stayed for all 11 seasons, which says everything about the kind of actor she was. Margaret Houlihan began as the straight-laced antagonist, whose nickname existed entirely as a punchline, and Swit spent years methodically dismantling that framing from the inside. The Margaret who appeared in the finale was decorated, emotionally honest, and fully 3-dimensional, a transformation that happened through Swit's insistence on playing the character as a real person. She was one of only 4 cast members to appear in both the pilot and the final episode, and in a show that rotated its male leads with regularity, she was the anchor the writers sometimes forgot to credit. MASH ran on CBS from 1972 to 1983, And the people who built it and then left it, for ambition, exhaustion, creative frustration, or simply because they knew when their part of the story was finished, shaped it just as much as the people who stayed.